by Friday.
On Blackboard?
On Blackboard, yeah. So, what'd you guys think of the exam?
Yeah.
Yeah? Well, I'm sure you did okay.
How much are you curving it by?
Huh? I don't know yet.
Don't put in once more. Curve it. You know what you're saying? It was easy. He's the outlier.
We'll see how it turns out later this week.
Yeah, you're really outliers and focus on the reading.
Okay, so we will have exam results by the end of the week. Moving forward with what comes next, we'll have 2 lectures this week, one on corporate strategy and one on global presence or international strategy. And then a discussion week next week. 2 more lectures, or 3 more lectures really in weeks 9 and 10, and then another review session before our second exam. And then basically starting in week 12 we get into guest lectures and then Thanksgiving, and all of a sudden like it's the end of the semester. So it'll go by fast. Okay, so today's lecture is on corporate strategy. So the idea here is at a big picture level. So not looking at just one particular line of business, but looking at multiple lines of business. So in a company like Disney, not just looking at movies, not just looking at music, not just looking at theme parks, but looking at the company as a whole and those different individual areas of operations. The idea with corporate strategy that we'll be coming back to in several different ways in this lecture is how to choose businesses that you're in such that there are linkages between the businesses. And ideally you want to share core competencies between businesses. So that is the most dynamic way to share corporate linkages. So not just anything that the company is good at, but the core things that are important to the success of each line of business. If those are common across the lines of business, it makes for a much stronger corporate linkage. So there's a number of different ways that you can identify or build linkages across lines of business. It could either be in the support activities or the primary activities. So you might have infrastructure, common buildings, or office space across different lines of business. You might have the same HR department across the different lines of business. You may have a similar IT department or similar IT systems across all the different lines of business. You might have centralized procurement so that you got more buying power with suppliers. those tend to be non-core competency linkages. Core competency linkages are usually found in the primary activities area of the value chain. So inbound logistics, all of the things that have to do with getting the raw materials for the product or service that you offer, the actual operations of the company in terms of making the product or service that you make, outbound logistics, so getting it out to market, and then your marketing and sales activities, actually talking to the market and making sure that people are aware of your product and service and are buying it, and then of course after the sales service, any of those 5 areas could be an area for core competency linkage between or across lines of business. There's 2 different kinds of diversification or coupling together of different lines of business, related and unrelated. So related tends to be a single or a dominant type of business, and you normally do that in order to achieve economies of scale. So the example here is McDonald's. If you purchase the supplies for making fast food in bulk, you get much better prices than if you purchase them individually. So there's an economy of scale in having lots of different McDonald's all over the place. But that's really the same line of business, just coupling many different individual fast food businesses into one large fast food business. So that's what's known as single or dominant business diversification. Related business diversification tends to take advantage of economies of scope. So an example that is kind of hard to see here, but it's Procter & Gamble, P&G. Procter & Gamble sells all kinds of different personal hygiene products, different kinds of consumer products, and the competency of how to market those products, how to build brand names and brand loyalty with customers is the same across, whether it's toothpaste or whether it's soap. It's the same competence for marketing across those different organizations. So they have an economy of scope in the intangible area of marketing. They also have an economy of scope in the tangible area of production, because the production technology that it takes to produce toothpaste is similar to the production technology that's needed to produce soap. It's similar production lines. You can adapt the equipment from making toothpaste to making soap in some cases without having to build an entirely new facility. So in both of those cases, there's an economy of scope where two different businesses have different needs that are served by the same corporate activity. So that's related business diversification. Finally, there's unrelated business diversification, and that's corporate parenting or identification of linkages between lines of business in the support activities area, rather than the core value chain activities. An example of this is General Electric. General Electric has they own TV stations. They make appliances. They have a finance division. They have businesses that have ostensibly nothing to do with each other that are all underneath the General Electric corporate umbrella. So they tend to share the same corporate office. They share support activities like similar IT infrastructure, similar HR or common HR department, common purchasing department. But the businesses don't have any economy of scope or economy of scale relationship to each other. So 3 different types of corporate diversification or corporate level strategy. The role of diversification. There's 2 types of diversification, or 3 types. Value creating diversification, value neutral diversification, and value reducing diversification. Value creating diversification takes advantage of things like economies of scope. Like I said in the last slide, related diversification. It can take advantage of market power. So, again, a company like Disney tends to have greater market power in their individual business segments of movies, theme parks, music, and so forth, because they're an entity at the entertainment industry level. So, market power by being involved in several different related businesses all at the same time. Or financial economies of scale, so financial economies like a common HR department, common IT department, common purchasing department. That also creates value by reducing the amount of overhead costs that each of the individual lines of business have, even if they're unrelated. Value neutral diversification is exemplified in things that tend to prompt antitrust litigation, regulation, tax laws, low performance, uncertain future cash flows, risk reduction, tangible resources or intangible resources. There are corporate combinations where there's not an economy of scale, there's not economy of scope, and there's not financial economies in the support activities of the firm. In that case, it's value neutral, and legislative bodies tend to look unfavorably on that kind of diversification. Finally, we've got value reducing diversification. Definitely not something you want to do as a corporate strategy. If the two ways that tend to reduce value in a corporate diversification or merger acquisition situation are when you diversify managerial and employment risks. So the stress on managers across businesses becomes greater as you connect them to each other. That tends to reduce value in your diversification, and then increasing managerial compensation. If you diversify in a way which leads to greater concentration of salary and benefits in the key top leadership of the organization, that also tends to reduce value in diversification. I'm going to pause here and let my colleague David Olson present to you guys quickly about the topic that is dear to his heart.
It really is. I'm a champion for international study abroad. Has anybody gone on an international study abroad experience of any type? Excellent. Where are you from? Okay. Has anybody traveled abroad? All right. Excellent. So, yes, so that's part of my job now to try to facilitate international study abroad. And so I've put together a course that has two components to it. One of the components is to fly from LAX down to Santiago, Chile on December 30th and spend the next week in Santiago, Chile, or in Chile. And we'll be visiting a number of different businesses, a couple of museums, a university, one of the top football programs in the world, marketing program, and probably a game, and the Andes Mountains, the port of Valparaiso, a winery, and a couple of restaurants in the course of a week. So that's half the class. And the requirements are to be there, to participate, to keep a personal journal, and a personal and professional journal, what you think about the things we did as a person and as a business student. The second thing is, in a small team environment, be responsible for one of the days and all the activities that took place in that day, chronicling them and putting them into some sort of a video presentation with maybe slideshow or something like that. And then the other component of the class is, this is a 3-unit course for the spring that you would sign up for, and that 3 units would be in international management, and we will meet once per month roughly, or 4 times on Saturday, probably a Saturday afternoon. And we'll be covering 2 books that are kind of fun, not textbooks, that relate to different aspects of international business. And so it costs, in addition to the tuition that you normally pay for taking a class, it costs a little over $3,000 for this class. You have to pay for airfare, which is maybe $1,000 or $1,200, something like that, to get down there. And there's a cost of $2,000 or so, $2,300 if there's 50 students, and if we get up to 20 students, it'll be a little under $2,000. So a little $3,000 or slightly more to do the travel part of this class. Yes?
Can you go just for travel with that?
Well, that is possible. So, yes, but it doesn't save you any money. Unless you have to pay for tuition, then you could take it and not get any units. But there is a small fee associated with that, and you get sort of 1 unit, or you get something like a unit for doing it that way. But it's not going to. It's not. That wouldn't be about saving yourself money, unless, like I say, you would be paying extra to take those 3 units. Then you could save the cost of those 3 units. What are the questions? Who's interested? I'm not asking for your blood or anything. Nobody's interested?
Joss was graduating this semester.
Who's graduating? Okay, so most of you are graduating. Those who are graduating, who is interested in MBA? This is for MBA students too. So you can have your first 3 units of your MBA. Would anybody like a flyer? By the way, even if you're graduating, a lot of you, let me ask you this question: who's looking for a job? Who will be looking for a job when you graduate? So a lot of you are. This will be the best line item you have on your resume. Oh, here we go. Everybody needs a line item on their resume that they can talk about. because there's sort of two questions that every job interviewer will ask you. And one of them is, what can you do for me? And the other one is, tell me how you can communicate and relate to different people in different environments. And that second question, they're going to get from your resume. They're going to look at a line on your resume. They're going to pick something out that's most interesting. And they're going to say, David, tell us about this trip that you took to Chile that you have on your resume. It says you took this short-term study abroad business trip to Chile. Was that just a lot of fun? Or was there something else about it? And if you're prepared for your interview, then you know what to say at that point. And you're going to say something like, it was a life-changing experience. And let me tell you why. Because we didn't just visit some businesses. We visited the national soccer team marketing division. And I recognized from that experience that business is everywhere. And if you want to be successful, you need to understand how to relate to people whose primary interest is in generating funds for a soccer team. And we went to the Pablo Neruda Museum, and I had no idea about this character who changed the nature of the political environment in Chile and is a famous writer. But I recognize now that it's the cultural interactions that people have that make or break every business. And so, if you go on this trip, or if you don't go on this trip, my advice to you is to have a line on the resume prominently that you can tell a story, and that you know what that story is before they ask it. Because that's what's going to separate you from everybody else at the interview. For whatever job it is, they're going to want to know that you can communicate, you can relate to different people in different situations, and that you offer something for that particular company. So find that line item that you're going to want to talk about. That's your job on every interview, is to help them understand why you're the best candidate. And that line item is going to do it for you. So if you have any questions, I need people to sign up. I need at least 15 people to sign up to make this trip go. That has to happen by the 30th. $600 deposit. It's refundable if you change your mind by the 30th or the 31st. And that has to go to Austral, the website on here. So sign up if you're interested. You can change your mind by the 31st and get that deposit back. Or email me if you have any other questions. DOLSON. Any other questions right now?
What are the dates for this trip?
December 30 to January 6th. It's supposed to be really cool. I wanted to wait. And they said, no, you need to be here for New Year's. I guess it's a pretty big deal. So I've been in San Miguel Allende for Holy Week, Semana Santos, and I've been in Portugal for Semana Santos. So I know these Latin people know how to celebrate, and so when they said no, you need to be here for New Year's, I think that they probably celebrate pretty big. So that's what they convinced me. And you know this quite well too, no?
Yes, I do.
Spending several years in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
Is New Year's a big thing there?
It is.
Powerful?
It's a lot of fun.
Holding back.
I think he's holding back.
Maybe a little bit.
Thank you very much.
Oh, no problem, David.
Thank you.
Well, the true question is, do you remember New Year's?
I do.
So it wasn't that much fun.
Okay, so moving on with corporate level strategy. Some sort of big picture theory about corporate level strategy. There's a book written by I believe, Nobel laureate Ronald Coase way back in 1937, talking about visible versus invisible market mechanisms. And the paraphrased summary of the book is basically that outside the firm, price movements direct production, which is coordinated through a series of exchange transactions in the market. Within a firm, these market transactions are eliminated, and in place of the complicated market structure with exchange transactions is substituted the entrepreneur coordinator who directs production. So the idea here is that there's two different ways to organize business activities. One of them is by having those activities within one firm, so that the entrepreneur coordinator or the management leadership team of the company can set strategy directly for those business activities. Another way that business activities happen is as the result of transactions between different companies. So the question is, what business activities should be underneath a single corporate entity, and which business activities should be done by the market? This leads to a theory called transaction cost theory. Transaction costs represent things like search for proper other partners for your business, negotiation with other companies, contracts to solidify agreements between different companies, monitoring to make sure that the terms of contracts are maintained, enforcement, etc., and price, or the cost associated with having market transactions rather than internal organization of activities. The process of deciding what activities should be inside the company and which activities should be done by the market involves 3 steps. Basically, first, disaggregating, and that means looking at each individual business activity separately. So HR management looked at as a separate activity, IT management looked at as a separate activity, inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics, all of these looked at as separate business activities. Then determine the competency, frequency, and uncertainty of each of those. So basically, how good are you as a company at performing each of these activities? How often do you need to perform these activities? And how much uncertainty is there about the outcome of these activities? So is it pretty predictable that you do this kind of advertising of positions and this kind of interviewing, and you end up with hiring these kind of people? It's relatively predictable. Or is it like new product development in the pharmaceutical business, where you could spend millions of dollars and years worth of time and not come up with any new drug. It's hit or miss, or wildcat oil drilling, where you drill and prospect with a certain piece of land, not knowing whether there's going to be oil there or not. So determining determining how good you are as a company at doing something, how often it happens, and how much uncertainty there is surrounding it, leads to then making a decision whether you make or buy. And make or buy means make means you're doing it inside the company. Buy means that it's a transaction out in the marketplace between other firms. So those are the basics of transaction cost theory. Growth can lead to economies of scope and scale. There's two different types of integration of companies when you're combining business lines at a corporate level. One is vertical integration, and the other is horizontal integration. Vertical integration is pictured here in the example of meat processing. So there's various elements of the value chain in meat production. There's the actual feeding and raising and maintaining of cattle, the not fun part for the cattle, the slaughterhouse. And then once you've killed the cows and chopped them up into pieces, you have to put those in those pieces in refrigerated railroad cars, or they're going to go bad. And then those railroad cars go to various distribution points, and those distribution points have cooled warehouses, which store the meat for a certain period of time. The warehouses then send the meat to meat packing plants, which package the meat into different meat products, whether it's for the butcher shop or whether it's included in various other processed foods or whatever. Delivery wagons is a bit out of date, but delivery trucks to deliver the various meat products to the end consumer locations, and then finally a supermarket or a grocery store or a restaurant where the meat products are actually sold and then consumed. Each of those could be a separate business. So the cattle farmer may be a different business than the slaughterhouse. The slaughterhouse may be a different business than the transportation of the meat products post slaughterhouse. Or you can combine those businesses into one overall business. If you combine various elements of the value chain like that, it's called vertical integration. There's two different ways or two different directions you can vertically integrate. You can integrate forward or backward. Forward means going towards the end consumer in the value chain. Backward means going back towards the original suppliers in the value chain. So that's vertical integration. The other type of integration is horizontal integration. The example we have here is oil refineries. So there's oil refineries, various independent oil refineries in Texas, various independent oil refineries in California, various independent oil refineries in Alaska. If one company buys all those oil refineries, that's an example of horizontal integration. So the businesses are not separate parts of the value chain. They're all the same type of business, but you're integrating many individual businesses into one large business. That is horizontal integration. Change arenas. Vertical integration. So change arenas for vertical integration. You can go backwards into industries that produce inputs for your core products, or you can go forward into industries that use distributors to sell your products, just like I was saying before about vertical integration. Why would you do this? One reason is to build barriers to entry. The more parts of the value chain that you control under one roof, the harder it is for other companies to get into the business. Facilitate investment in specialized assets. So sometimes if you own both the refrigerated warehouses as well as the refrigerated transportation, there's some economies to be gained in buying and maintaining refrigeration equipment. So investment in specialized assets like that is sometimes another reason for vertical integration. Protecting product quality. If you control the farm, you control the transport of the meat products, you control the packaging, then you can control the quality of the product a lot better than if you're only involved in one of those areas. And then results in improved scheduling. If you control all the different parts of the value chain, you can control when they happen, and you can organize efficiencies in the scheduling of different activities. Some examples of vertical integration are Mgmt, Apple, and IBM. So Apple combines a number of different parts of the phone development value chain. So it's not just the development of the software, it's not just the production of the physical phone, it's not just the transportation of the end products to the consumer, it's not just the retail sales of the product. Apple does all of those things. So, for an example of vertical integration, similar for Mgmt and IBM. Change arenas for horizontal integration. So horizontal integration, like I said in the prior slide, is acquiring or merging with industry competitors to achieve competitive advantage. So a lot of times that has to deal with economy of scope or market power. Having as many of the types of businesses, as many of the businesses in a certain type of industry integrated into one as possible. So like I just said, one of the reasons to do that is achieving economies of size or scale, which lowers your operating costs. Increased product differentiation. So if you own all of the different businesses that make a certain product, you have a lot more control over the features of that product, the level of differentiation. It's a way of reducing industry rivals, so it's a way of reducing competition by buying your competitors, basically. And it increases bargaining power for other parts of the supply of the value chain. So if you integrate all of the different oil refineries, it gives more buying power over the oil exploration folks. It gives more market power over the end retail part of the value chain. Some examples of horizontal integration: Pfizer, Warner Lambert, and Wyatt. And then like American Airlines and US Air merging in the same airline industry there is a good example of horizontal integration. There tends to be a curvilinear relationship between diversification and performance. So if you have a dominant business, horizontal integration versus a related diversification where you've got different lines of business, but they're related in core competency in some way, versus a corporate umbrella or parent organization where you've got financial economies in the support functions, but not any synergies in the core value chain production activities of the firm. The one that results in the best corporate performance tends to be related diversification. So different types of businesses, but they share common core value chain activities as core competencies. The BCG matrix. When you're evaluating individual lines of business, there's a tool that the consulting firm called Boston Consulting Group, BCG, came up with for assessing the attractiveness of different different businesses for purchase. So one way of looking at different businesses is to measure the amount of market growth rate of the market for the products or services of that business, whether it's low or high, and the market share that your business has in that business, whether it's low or high. So they came up with kind of cute titles for each of these types of businesses. So if you have high market growth rate, so the demand for the product or the service is growing rapidly, and you've got a high market share of that market, that's a star company. If you've got a high market share, but it's in an industry that's not growing very dynamically, that's what's called that's what's known as a cash cow. If you've got a high market growth rate, but you've got a relatively low share of that market, it's a question mark. And if you've got what you don't want is a low growing market and a low share of that market, that's a dog. You want to get rid of those businesses if possible, or not purchase them to begin with. A little bit more extensive taxonomy or list of different types of businesses. This time, looking at sales on one axis and time from entry into the market to exit into the market on the other side, or on the other axis. When you very first get into the market and sales aren't very big, those are called infant companies. Then when sales start to grow rapidly and more time has passed, you've got those two types of businesses that were in the prior slide. Stars, which are high share and high growth of the marketplace, and problem children, or question marks, the same thing. Low share in a high growth industry. When sales peak later in the development of an industry, you've got cash cows and dogs, just like the other matrix on the former page. Cash cows being high share in a low growth business, and dogs being a low share in a low growth business. And then finally, when the market begins to decline and sales go down, the life cycle for any industry eventually has a decline in sales and a disappearance of that industry. As sales decline, if you've got a high market share, it's what's known as a warhorse, and if you've got a low market share in a negative growth industry, that's another thing you don't want. That's called a dodo. So different names for different types of businesses that one might purchase or merge with in corporate level strategy. So there's three basic different ways of diversifying and getting into new lines of business as an organization. One is acquisition by buying another company. One is internal new ventures. So basically, you're starting a whole new company within your company. You're starting a whole new department or division of your company. And a third way of getting into new lines of business is joint venture. So cooperating with another company to develop a new line of business. With mergers, acquisitions, takeovers, and restructurings, all different ways of combining lines of business in a corporate level strategy. They're all different ways to have quick access to resources and market share. So rather than building a new company from scratch, these methods, merger, acquisition, takeover, restructuring, are ways to rapidly get into a new line of business. They tend to be sort of plagued by problems with integrating corporate cultures and integrating MIS systems. So whenever you do a merger or an acquisition of another company, or you merge two independent companies together, there tends to be a lot of problems with integrating corporate cultures and integrating IT systems. Ideally, the reason that you merge companies, or the reason that you acquire another company at a corporate level strategy level of thinking is in order to achieve synergies. So, like we talked about at the beginning, there should be linkages between the various lines of business that allow for savings of costs and or development of greater capabilities. The difference between mergers, acquisitions, takeovers, and restructurings: a merger is basically when two firms agree to integrate into one on a relatively co-equal basis. An acquisition is where one firm buys controlling interest in another. A takeover is the same thing as an acquisition, except that the firm that is purchased did not want to be purchased. It's a hostile takeover. And then restructuring, significant changes to financing and operations of a firm. So it's changing sometimes one line of business into two lines of business by splitting up things that used to be together. So it's the opposite of combining businesses. You can also split businesses apart into separate lines of business. I've got a slide here on the brief history of mergers and acquisitions. From the tail end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of horizontal integrations that took place in the marketplace. U.S. Steel, DuPont, Standard Oil are some examples of these, and that tended to raise antitrust concerns on the part of the government. That then led to an era which started in the beginning of the 20th century and went to about the middle of the 20th century of vertical integration, where like we talked about in that slide before, you're purchasing various businesses in different different stages of the value chain of an industry and combining them all into one business. So Ford and National Dairy are some examples of that. From the middle of the 20th century towards the tail end of the 20th century, there was a trend towards corporate conglomerates and leveraged buyouts. So GE and RJR Nabisco, there was a trend towards combining businesses in order to achieve financial economies in back office functions like HR, information systems, purchasing, things like that. And then from the end of the 20th century until now, the trend has been lately towards knowledge-based internationalization or industry consolidation, mergers and acquisitions. So if there's different lines of business that require similar types of knowledge, that's been a trend in business mergers in the last couple of decades. Buying horizontally or integrating companies horizontally that do the same business but in different international markets has been a trend. And consolidation of the industry. So basically, again, horizontal integration with some of the major competitors in an industry combining with each other to make less competitors in that industry. That's been kind of the trend more recently. I believe Disney, Apple, and Marriott and Starwood are some examples of those. That was the last slide. So what I want to do before we call it a day is chat briefly about, first of all, economy, single or dominant business versus related business versus unrelated business, diversification. I've got 3 examples up here: McDonald's, Procter & Gamble, and General Electric. Who can think of another example of a single or dominant business diversification? Yes.
Would Starbucks be one?
Yes, definitely. Starbucks is a good example of combining different individual coffee shops all into one big coffee shop company. Yes. In a way, yes. In a way, I'd say that Walmart actually combines. You don't see it in the sort of public face of Walmart, but they tend to vertically integrate backwards into the supply chain. So I would actually call that a related business diversification. Who can think of another example of related? Any of the 3? Yes.
Maybe Amazon?
Why? What about Amazon?
I feel like Amazon is just like everyone when they shop online on their things to go first is Amazon. So I feel like they're like taking a lot in the online buying industry. I would say so.
Yeah, I think over the course of time, Amazon has purchased some other online platforms for online buying that led to horizontal integration like that into.
They bought Whole Foods.
What's that?
They bought Whole Foods.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
I actually call. Hang on one second. I'd call Whole Foods another example of related business diversification. They actually, Whole Foods is a retailer of food physically. Well, I guess it's 2 different forms of retail: brick and mortar and electronic, and they're purchasing Whole Foods in order to
achieve synergies, and the line is kind of blurring increasingly between what you buy in a brick and mortar location and what you buy online. So yeah, I would agree that it is kind of it's both. It's both single business and related business. Yes.
I was going to give like an example, like PG&E for economies of scale.
Uh-huh.
Or I guess like any like electric or like gas company, and those are instances in which economies of scale are actually beneficial to like the public in general. So like for example, you talk about PG&E. If you have like a gas company that encompasses several states through horizontal integration through multiple like locations throughout those states, then it's more beneficial because it lowers the cost for everybody. So I was saying PG&E would be an example of a dominant or a single business.
Yep, that's a good example of a dominant or single business. Who can think of it? Go ahead.
We're on the unrelated business, like AAA.
What about AAA?
I'm saying that you have the insurance leg, they have like a financial life insurance, but they also do like travel discounts. So it's kind of a bunch of different things that they're working on.
Yeah, that is kind of an example of unrelated diversification. The travel discount stuff doesn't have much to do at all with the insurance side of things or financial services. Good point. Who can think of another example of either related or unrelated diversification? Anyone? Yes.
I think it's unrelated, but like, I have a Costco card, right?
Uh-huh.
And you would think the Costco card is only for shopping inside the store, but they have so many like other things you can do with it, like travel programs, sometimes movie ticket discounts. They're completely unrelated, but with the card lets you have access to all of it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so that's unrelated, right?
It is. I think that's more a case of Costco cooperating with other companies to increase the benefits of Costco membership. So I guess
But that'd be like support activities.
it's, yeah, it is. I would say that's, it's almost an example of a joint venture rather than a merger acquisition kind of thing. Because Costco is cooperating with other companies to give benefits to their customers that are relatively unrelated to the core business of selling food and supplies at wholesale costs. Good point. Any other examples?
Well, when thinking about a merger and acquisition and unrelated businesses like Kraft Heinz,
Uh-huh.
weird. Why would Kraft? Heinz is like tomato stuff, and Kraft is like different. So
They both make food, though.
way different kinds of food.
Yeah, but the competence at making food, even if it's condiments versus cheese, there's some similar competencies in any kind of food processing, the quality control, things like that. So I would call that a related diversification. Can anybody think of a good example other than the meat packing industry? A good example of vertical integration? Yes.
Military.
Huh?
Military.
Yeah, it's not a private business, but an interesting version of vertical integration of.
What about cotton?
What's that?
Cotton?
Cotton. Do the companies that make clothes out of cotton own cotton farms?
Probably not.
If they do, that would be an example of vertical integration. If they don't, then it wouldn't be.
I think so. Vertical, they could be separate
businesses. Oh, but you're saying same owner but separate businesses?
What's that?
On the vertical integration,
Mhm.
that you were saying that every stage could be a different business. So you're saying different business, not different business owner.
They didn't mean to say that it's for offsets, right?
What I meant was, if those different businesses have the same business owner, it's vertical integration. If they have different business owners, it's not vertical integration. Who can think of another example of vertical integration?
Farming,
What's that?
farming,
How so?
like blueberry farms, they grow blueberries, they put cold storage, package plant.
And that's the same company that does the cold storage and the packaging and the growing?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Great example of vertical integration. There's a lot of vertical integration in the agriculture industry in general. Any other examples?
Wineries,
Wineries?
grow their own grapes, make their own wine.
Yep. You could just have a vineyard and a wine and the wine production as a separate business, but if they're owned by the same company, the wine production and the vineyard, then it's the way most wineries are. It's a good example of vertical integration. Yes.
Well, I actually have a company name for that one. I think it's Gigabyte.
What about Gigabyte?
They make their own computer parts and everything, and they also sell it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they make it and sell it to other companies and also sell it themselves. Because I have a laptop from them, and they actually made it there.
Okay, so they make the components and sell like complete laptops?
Yeah.
Okay, great example. Great example. Some of the other, like, depending on whether it's Dell or IBM or Apple, there's greater or Gigabyte, you said?
Yeah.
Or Gigabyte. There's different competitors in the computer hardware industry have varying levels of vertical integration. Some of them vertically integrate more, some of them vertically integrate less.
Yeah, it's not that many.
Anybody have a good example of horizontal integration?
Could it be like the Wonderful Company, how they buy almonds from other farmers?
Yep.
and then they-
Yep. So wonderful, sort of having a monopoly on almond production is a great example of horizontal integration. Anybody have another example?
Oh, I think of telecom companies.
Okay.
Like for example, AT&T, they'll do roaming off a specific regional carrier, but eventually they'll just incorporate it into AT&T.
Yep.
Right.
So AT&T purchasing other telecom carriers is a great example of horizontal integration. Good point. Any other examples? Okay. How about this BCG matrix here? Anybody think of a good example of an infant company? So low sales level and very early in the development of the industry.
I don't know the name of it, but it's that new Bitcoin. The new one that just came out.
A new Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's splintering off the original. There's a brand new company that just came out. It's going to start doing a new Bitcoin. Because the old Bitcoin is all unstable.
The old Bitcoin is what?
Unstable.
Unstable?
Yeah. It's like one day it'll be $50 for one, the next day it'll be $2,000 for one. Shit about Bitcoin.
I'm not sure whether that's like a new industry forming or if it's refinement of the existing online currency business. I might think of that new company more as a problem child or a question mark than an infant. So once
Has
it's
to be a new industry?
what's that?
It has to be a new industry. It can't be an existing industry.
Like how so?
Well, you said you're not sure if it's a new industry versus an existing one that they're working on. matrix is based on new industries?
The matrix is based on individual industries, so it's the time from the beginning of that industry to the end of that industry
So you mean like
on the x-axis.
So like the new Amazon thing where they're using drones to deliver stuff, whatever it's called.
Uh-huh.
That's a whole new industry that wasn't else until now. So that's a good thing, right?
Yeah. Personalized delivery of consumer products via drone is a new industry. So, does Amazon actually own the drones, or does another company own and run the drones?
Sure. Well, I know they, the other company owns it or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Amazon actually owns and runs the drones or whether they contract with another company. But regardless, that would be a good example of an infant. It's just beginning that delivery of online of delivery of goods purchased online via drone. How about an example of a star? High market share and high growth.
Tesla.
Huh?
Tesla.
Yep. Tesla's a great example. By far and away, they're the dominant player in electric vehicles, or at least high-end electric vehicles, and the demand for high-end electric vehicles is growing rapidly. So, great example. How about a cash cow? So, low growth and high market share.
GM.
Yeah, good example. They've got a large share of the market, but the demand for new automobiles is relatively stagnant. So, yeah, good example. How about an example of a warhorse? So, declining sales, a market that's kind of,
Post office.
yeah, that's a great example. The U.S. Postal Service.
Sad.
The U.S. Postal Service has practically a monopoly. I mean, if you don't count express delivery services like UPS and Federal Express, they have practically a monopoly on mail delivery. But physical mail delivery is kind of not in demand as much as it used to be. So, great example. Any other examples of warhorses? Okay, well, it's 3:42. It's a couple minutes before the end of class. So let's call it a day for today, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.